collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, there was widespread outrage after last weekend's demonstration against government corruption was met with overwhelming police violence, leaving people injured and several arrested. A new Freedom of Information Act should bring greater transparency to the public sector. We hear how you can go about accessing the information you need answers to.
It entered into force on the 22nd of December last year. So as of that date, you as a citizen, are allowed to write to the public sector and ask for information. And the government, or the public sector to be exact, have 30 days to reply.
And the Social Welfare Department also under fire earlier this week after murders in Tseri, and questions arose as to how cases are handled and whether or not mental health issues should be considered by the department.
From the announcement from the head of the Social Welfare Services, that mental health issues are not the responsibility of the Social Welfare Service.
It's almost a week since police used unprecedented violence against demonstrators in Nicosia who were protesting against government corruption in defiance of a ban on public gatherings and demonstrations, purportedly put in place to stop the spread of coronavirus, but seen by many as a way to silence criticism of the authorities in the wake of the scandals surrounding the golden passports or citizenship by investment scheme, which was scrapped by the government in November after a damning exposé by Al Jazeera revealed that the corruption reached the higher echelons of authority, including the Speaker of the House of Representatives. As the protesters assembled, almost all of them wearing the mandatory masks and trying to stay at distance from each other, they were greeted by intimidating lines of police in full riot gear, flanking a newly acquired water cannon, to all intents and purposes well kitted out and looking for a fight. And the fact that some of the officers had taped over the identification numbers on their helmets would seem to bear this out. They used tear gas, pepper spray and flashbangs, but the crowd kept chanting and held their ground. So the police deployed the water cannon, with tragic consequences later in the day on central Makarios Avenue, where it aimed straight at a young woman who was knocked to the ground and sustained a serious eye injury, which might, even after emergency surgery, leave her partially sighted. Those who went to help her were set upon by the police. For the most part, people have been so angered by footage of the violence that many more are expected to join a second demonstration which has been called for tomorrow, again to call out corruption and also to protest about what is widely seen as state violence against Cypriot citizens.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Particularly bearing in mind the events of the past week or so in Cyprus, it may be of interest to you that there is now, apparently since December, the equivalent in Cyprus of a Freedom of Information Act. Now, as a journalist, it's something that I've been hoping for many, many years. But what does it actually cover? Well, we're joined by Nicosia lawyer Achilleas Dimitriadis, who's already made requests through this mechanism and received answers. Achilleas, thanks again for joining us. Now, tell us about how long it took us to get this into legislation, because it is something that's been missing until December.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Freedom of information, it's actually called the Law on the Right of Access to Public Sector Information of 2017. So it took us quite a bit of time to get it on the statute book. It was enacted in 2017, but the government, or the House actually, gave a 3-year grace period so that the government could prepare for it, and it entered into force on the 22nd of December last year. So as of that date, you as a citizen, are allowed to write to the public sector and ask for information. Now, public sector means a lot of bodies, so you can ask for the municipality, you can ask for the water authority, and of course the government. So public is a wide definition. You can ask by email, which I find fantastic because you don't need to apply in person. And so an email to the appropriate person, or perhaps the Director General, if there is no appropriate person, would do the job. And there is also a fee, which I understand is not being enforced by most of the departments that give out this type of information. And a simple email to the person saying that you are making a request under the Freedom of Information law, that you want this information, that you are willing to pay whatever fee there is, if any, and the government, or the public sector to be exact, have 30 days to reply. And that's the amazing thing, because contrary to popular belief, the 30 days was taken seriously, at least to 3 applications that I have made. I tried the House of Representatives, I tried the police, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and all 3 bodies within the 30 days replied, and actually on 2 of the 3 occasions got the information I had requested.
You mentioned the police there, but I thought that there was an exception in this legislation that referred particularly to intelligence services, the National Guard and the police and other security bodies.
Well, there's a bit of an art in this. I was interested in the report that the press office of the police had given out in relation to the parody account that I was dealing with, that the Minister of Justice was involved. And the police had said that more than 49 similar cases had already been investigated by the police. So I wrote to the police and said, without asking names, I've asked for the period of the last 5 years, whether they could give me this information, and a breakdown of the office these politicians held when they asked for this information. And sure enough, I think on day 25 or 26, I can't remember exactly, the letter came, a beautiful table saying so many people did this, so many people did that, so many people did something else. You have to be careful, and it's quite an art, especially in the United States. Extracting information from the state is an art, and then one has to be very careful. There are some rules, but there are few rules of thumb that one can follow, and one is you do not ask for personal information, because you'll get a reply saying that this is protected by the data protection legislation, so we cannot give names. But they can give numbers, they can give descriptions, and they can give information. One case I did with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I say this because it's public knowledge and people can deal with it, there was a report by the Specialist Committee of the German Parliament, and it was in German, and of course I can't read German, but I thought that maybe the Cyprus government would have taken the report and got a translation. So I wrote to the ministry saying, I understand this was issued, I understand that it is likely that you have a translation in English, would you give me the copy? They wrote back saying, well, we don't have an accurate translation. I said, well, thank you very much, give me then the inaccurate translation that you have. And sure enough, I got the translation, and with Google Translate, I think I can manage. So that's the kind of simple things that people can get going. And get information whereas citizens, they are entitled to it.
Right, but is it a question of knowing who you have to write to? If you have a particular request from a particular, let's say, sector of the civil service, do you write to that sector? Or is there an overarching...
No, there is no overarching provision. There is the Commissioner of Information, who is also the Commissioner of Data Protection. She has a supervising role, and in fact, she is the person you apply if the provisions of the law you believe have not been complied with. So essentially, if you write to the ministry, and I'll get to the person in a minute, and they do not reply, or they give you an excuse which you do not think that it applies under the law, you are entitled to file a complaint with the commissioner, and she will deal with it, and hopefully you will be vindicated. Now, who do you write? Well, the answer is that all public bodies have to have a plan to show that this system applies. Very few of them have done it, I understand. But a safe bet would be the Director General. So if it's the Ministry of Finance, I think the Director General of the Ministry of Finance, you can get the email from the webpage, and you send your email and wait for a while. I mean, you can send a reminder on day 5 or 15 saying, I've sent you this, did you receive it? And take it from there. And because you can do it by email, it's so much simpler. And access is given to the public to the possibility of obtaining this information. Admittedly, it's not an easy task, and there are, as you have rightly said, a lot of exceptions, especially for police or military matters or personal data, but there is a plethora of information out there that people may want to find out, which you can get. I mean, if next to your house there is a plot, a vacant plot, and you want to ask the price, that information is available on the internet now. You can Google your property and find the one next to it, and you can identify the price. You don't know to whom it belongs. That's the next question. If it's a person, they will not give you the information. But if it's a company, they will give you the information, because companies do not have the protection of data, of personal data. So there are ways of doing it, and you can look it up and you can try, and it's a trial and error, I'm afraid, but it's something that people should understand that it's their right, and it's something that people should try for, and sometimes you get it right.
What sort of use do you think the average citizen could put this to?
Well, I gave you my examples. I mean, I had asked for something in relation to the police. I had a translation from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and had also asked the House of Parliament to send me a copy, to give me details of the Yorgaji list that they have made. I was shot down on that one, saying that it was personal information, which I thought was fine. But then it was actually published, so I wouldn't dare say it was my letter that did it, but it's out there in the public, so people can look at it. But anything you need, I mean, what's the sort of crazy idea? How much does it cost to run the presidential palace? Do you know?
Not a clue.
No. Are you interested to find out? Maybe.
Yeah.
So you write to the Ministry of Finance or to the presidential palace, and you say, please let me know how much it costs to run the garden. And they have to tell you, because they have to do it on a monthly basis. I mean, ask for information that is easily traceable, because there's always a reply, oh, we can't find this, is too detailed, or, it's impossible to trace this type of information. But start with general things. How much does it cost to run the presidential palace, without excluding the salaries of the persons who are working there? So what are the running expenses? And then you go down and you find out how much it costs for the garden, how much it costs for food, and what have you. Now, if people are interested, I mean, I don't know if people are interested in this, but it's this kind of information that a citizen may feel that he or she want to have this information, and they are entitled to get it within 30 days, subject to the exceptions, as you have rightly pointed out.
Right, now how can you be sure that the information you're given is correct and true?
Fine, that's a very interesting point. The law says that they have to give you correct information. In fact, it's a criminal offense if they distort the information or if it's false. So you have the safety of the complaint to the commissioner, and then the commissioner can either impose an administrative fine or even proceed to give a criminal sanction. I mean, people tend to believe that the state is honest and that it will not cheat you in this way. But assuming this happens, I guess you can verify it. And of course, there's always the most powerful weapon, which is to publicize it. I got this information from Mr. X in government officially, and it is blatantly wrong. Mr. X, would you care to comment why this happened? And social media are now so accessible and so powerful that I think the verification of the information that you will eventually have received can be subjected to scrutiny. And of course, reporters like yourself can now have an easy ride in getting the government or the public, to use the correct expression, to give this information.
Yes, because
it is our right as citizens, and it is their obligation as the public sector. I think that's the bottom line. And my approach is that the more visibility, the more transparency we have, the less of a problem is created by the state operating in conditions of corruption. So that's really the bottom line on this.
yes, okay, so if it works well, we should have all sorts of people asking for little bits and pieces here of information, but I'm thinking particularly since everybody's a taxpayer, it's one of the ways, is it not, of checking that the taxes we pay are being properly spent.
Oh, absolutely. The citizen has the power to ask the question, to test whether his taxpayer euros are properly used or misused. And if the taxpayer is interested or the citizen is interested to do this, now there is a avenue through which this can be pursued. And it's much better to have some tests on this avenue that exists, rather than sit back and try and pull out the difficulties that exist in an effort to excuse our inaction. As citizens, we are allowed, and I think we should, ask for this information because you keep the pressure on the government to do their job well. And after all, that's what they're being paid for.
Right, now I read in the article about this in the Cyprus Mail earlier this week that you've posted your email on your Twitter account as a possible model. Is there anywhere else for people who aren't on Twitter that people might be able to access your model so that it's sort of easy? Because I'm imagining that people who haven't done this before might be quite liable to make errors in their application that would mean it would be turned down.
Well, I don't know, but since you mentioned it, I'll post it on Facebook as well. So give me a few hours, I'll get down to putting it on Facebook, so people who are either on Twitter or on Facebook can have the model or the sample or the precedent to use, subject of course to changing the particular person that has been addressed and the information that you need. But it's no big deal. There is no specific formula. You just have to make sure that you refer to the law. You first ask whether the body which you are posing the question has the information. Assuming the answer is yes, then you ask for that information or part of it which interests you, and at the end you simply say that you're available to pay a fee, if any, in order to obtain it. In most cases there is no such fee. If there is one, I'm sure they will give you the amount, and also you can ask ways of paying it online, because this ability to ask these questions has become much easier because you can do it anytime from your computer and it will hopefully work.
And the fees, I mean, you say a lot of them are waived, but what sort of fees are we talking about?
I don't think it should be. I mean, I haven't had any request for fees, so I did 3 and there was 0. And I understand most of them are. But, for example, the Registrar of Companies has a system that charges for fees when you inspect public records. That will be applied. The Land Registration Office, if you need to carry out a search, there are fees. There are government departments that have a setup which requires the payment of a fee to get information. And I would have thought that those departments are equipped to charge. The others do not seem to be equipped, and I don't think they would like to do it because the cost will be disproportional. So you get the information for free. You just have to decide what you want. You have to identify the department you have to send it, put it in a way that you do not ask for masses of information so they can send you, well, this is too much and we can't really do it, and start low and slowly you expand. Start narrow and try and avoid the data protection, because that is a matter that will allow them to avoid disclosing the information.
Fascinating stuff, and it was long overdue. Achilleas Dimitriadis, thank you very much for telling us all about it.
Thank you, Rosie. Keep well and keep asking.
That is Achilleas Dimitriadis, prominent Nicosia lawyer, talking about that new law, which is the equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The shocking murder of 2 people and attempted murder of a third in Tseri, just outside Nicosia, earlier this week, well, that prompted all sorts of outpouring and questions as to whether or not the Social Welfare Service was doing its job. They've been criticised before, of course, a few years ago following the suicide of a young teenager. But domestic violence incidents might have been avoided, according to the Pan-Cyprian Psychological Association, if the Social Welfare Service had implemented the restructuring plan that was approved by the Cabinet back in 2013. So we might all be asking, and indeed I suppose we should be asking, why hasn't it been implemented? Joining us from the Pan-Cyprian Psychological Association is George Metaxas. George, thanks very much indeed. This is really terrible stuff that it seems lives might have been saved. First of all, have you any idea why the plan approved by the Cabinet all those years ago hasn't been implemented? Because I presume that your association must be working quite closely with the social welfare services, who obviously are dealing not just with vulnerable families, but also with families where there may be mental health issues.
Yes, actually we were very surprised yesterday from the announcement from the social welfare services, from the head of the social welfare services, that mental health issues are not the responsibility of the social welfare services. Actually, research shows, and we have research in Cyprus, that when you have social workers and psychologists working together, the results are much better, especially in risk assessment, which is the issue here. I cannot comment on certain cases, but when you have a family, you have probable violence in the family, the best way to handle it is to make a risk assessment, find those factors that are risk factors, find which protective factors there are in this family, and then make a plan and implement the plan to avoid the risk.
Am I right in thinking that best practice in other countries very much uses a holistic approach like that, and there are certain protocols that are used by mental health professionals working with welfare services?
Yes, and actually this is one part of our announcement, that the 2 tools, it's HCR 20 and SAPRO. Both are in NHS in England. They are used in Holland. They are used in Canada. And in other countries, they use different psychometric tools. But the main issue is that those tools are reflecting the decision of the ministry, but they are not implemented.
Now,
and we don't know why.
Well, it's quite unbelievable, really. Under which government ministry does the Social Welfare Service come? Because that's something that I come up against over and over again here, and that is the fragmented way that government services are rolled out, or not, as the case may be, because each one says, oh, that's not my department, that's them, and the other half of the problem is that's another department.
Yes, but the issue is that mental health problems are not only a responsibility of Ministry of Health. For example, we have the school psychology, which are under Ministry of Education. So it's not a question that if there is a psychological word in something, then this should be under Ministry of Health.
Should it not be a unified system that wherever mental health issues arise, there is a go-to department or association or whatever who can put the right person there to deal with it?
Yes, probably this would be the best solution, but this is a political question that politicians should answer, actually. The interesting thing is that the decision for a different approach in working for the social welfare services was made by this government. So it's a question for us as well. Why isn't this implemented?
Okay, so they've approved a plan back in 2013, and since then it looks like absolutely nothing's been done, and since then we've had certainly 3 deaths that we know of.
Yes, in 2019 there was the final decision for this plan, but since then nothing again happened.
What can the Psychologists Association do, if anything, to try and move this along and get some action from the government?
Actually, we had a lot of meetings with the Ministry of Social Insurance and Labor. She was very positive towards what we were saying, but probably we're meeting a lot of resistance from other instances, such as the head of the social welfare services. The last time we had an announcement, it was in 2019, in the beginning of 2019, and when they answered us, their answer was like, there are other specialties as well working in social welfare services, and this is not understandable to us because every time we speak with the Association of the Social Workers, we communicate very well. Professionals, we don't have any problem between each other. I mean, everyone from us knows where our limits are and what our job is.
Right, but if I'm a social worker working for the social welfare services, and I go along to see a family where I believe that there may be mental health issues, or indeed it seems it's emerged previous issues with violence, then am I able and allowed to call you up, for example, George, and ask your opinion or ask you to visit with me? Or is there a different protocol and forms I have to fill in through the social welfare service to get a second opinion?
Actually, the protocol for family violence, it says that the social worker should assess the risk for the child, for example. What we are saying is that in 2021, we have the tools to make this assessment. If you send a social worker without any tool, it's like trying to fix a machine of a car without any tools.
Are you saying basically that they're not properly trained for the job that they're doing?
Yes. And this is a systemic problem. But the usual solution is to say that, I don't know, a social worker is bored or that they are not doing their job as they should. And this is not beautiful because you have people as well. I don't think any one of them is happy from people dying or murders. They are feeling very bad. They have an enormous load of work to do. And the system should be able to help them. But if you have a systemic problem, we have to ask ourselves who's running the system.
Yes, we do. And we have to ask why people are dying because of incorrect procedures or a lack of training. It's really very worrying. Hopefully you will get an ear somewhere with the Social Welfare Department or indeed the Ministry of Health, George. And thank you very much indeed for joining us from the Pan-Cyprian Psychological Association.
Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.